Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the St. Patrick Centre. My name is Tim Campbell, I'm the director. Our St. Patrick Lecture Series has now been running for just about every month since September, and we've heard from historians, politicians, bishops and archbishops, representing many of the places that Patrick is associated with, including Wales, Scotland and Ireland. In all of those proceedings, we have not had the opportunity to welcome a County Down speaker. So it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce Professor Francis Campbell. Professor Campbell is a native of Rathfriland, and he was educated at St. Colman's College in Newry, St. Joseph's Seminary in Queen's in Belfast, and at the University of Pennsylvania. He joined the British Diplomatic Service in 1997 and was policy advisor and private secretary to Prime Minister Tony Blair in the early 1990s. He became the first secretary to at the British Embassy in Rome, and later the British ambassador to the Holy See. He's so famous, a programme was made about him, with 3 episodes. After working as the Deputy High Commissioner to Pakistan, he was head of the policy unit at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and head of innovation at UK Trade and Investment. In 2014, Professor Campbell became Vice-Chancellor of St Mary's University, Twickenham. And we're absolutely delighted that you have agreed to come and talk to us tonight, Professor, on the subject of St Patrick and reconciliation. So I would like to welcome you to the stage.
Tim, thank you very much for the welcome this evening, and it's always a delight to be back in Downpatrick. Bishop Harold and members of the clergy and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honour and privilege to be invited to give the latest lecture in this series of the St Patrick's Lecture Series. And my title this evening is Shared Society and the Role of St Patrick in Reconciliation. When I was talking in London about coming over here, they missed out the bit on shared society and the role of St Patrick in reconciliation. And by the end of the week, somebody said to me, "Why are you going to Northern Ireland to talk about St Patrick and Brexit?" I'm sure he did have something to say about it, but we just don't know it yet. But no doubt Mark Francois will remind us sometime soon. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a real delight to be here in the St Patrick Centre and to see the absolutely fantastic work that has been done here in building up both knowledge of St Patrick and also developing the economy in line with what expectations are there from tourists who come from abroad. It's nice to be giving this talk, as Tim has said, as a native of this county and to be back in the county town. I would like to thank both Tim and the board for this very kind invitation. And ladies and gentlemen, with your permission, I would also like to pay tribute at the outset to someone of outstanding integrity and professionalism in our midst, someone that I have known for most of, in fact, all of my adult life, and in fact, most of my teenage life, and that is Margaret Ritchie. Just 2 nights ago in London, we had a lecture at the university by the former Taoiseach John Bruton. And Margaret, your ears must have been burning at that table afterwards, because so many people recalled your integrity, your courage and your fortitude. And we all know the battle that you've had with personal health these last years. And in the way that you've fought that, I know that you have given so many people immense courage with the witness. So thank you for being here, and thank you for all that you have done for our society. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic that you have set me this evening is not easy. It's not easy because often it is simpler for people to talk about other places, to keep it professional and distant, rather than to talk about that which is personal to them or immediate. So the title, Shared Society and the Role of St Patrick in Reconciliation. Can we keep it remote? Can we keep it distant? I doubt so. This evening, I suspect for most of us, the topic of a shared society of reconciliation is neither distant nor simply professional, but can be up close and personal. Roughly at this hour, on this Friday night in 1998, some 20 odd miles from where we are now, but in this county, agreement was reached on what was officially known as the Belfast Agreement, or popularly known as the Good Friday Agreement. 21 years on, we are still discussing that agreement. And tonight, another deadline loomed large, that of the 12th of April, midnight to be precise, and the day that the country in its entirety could easily have simply rolled out of the European Union. That was averted in the early hours of yesterday morning. Now our next deadline is Halloween. So tonight, as we talk about St. Patrick, a shared society and reconciliation, I'm afraid we can't keep it distant and remote. It must be alive and real. It must have a context. If it doesn't have a context, then I'm afraid we are simply avoiding reconciliation and how to understand and listen to the other. We are simply affirming our own perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, with your permission, I want to do three things in this short time that we have this evening. I want to say something about society, so that we simply do not assume we are talking about a notion which we think we all know about and agree on, but which actually is viewed very differently depending on our perspective. Parallel meanings and discussions can be fatal in a society, so clarifying what society actually is and why it is important will help us to recognise it and what our place and role is within it. Second, I want to say something about reconciliation. What is it? What are we actually reconciling in this society? Is it theology? Is it political identity? Is it difference? If so, what difference? Are we trying to achieve a sort of sameness? Is that consistent with a healthy society? So if difference is fundamental to society, then what do we mean by reconciliation? Are we reconciling differences or living with them, simply accepting the other for what they are and accepting them as they are? Are we speaking of reconciliation of groups or of individuals? To speak of reconciliation, we must first know or discern who we are and what our identities are. Again, if we are not careful about these terms and what we mean, we could find that efforts at reconciliation actually serve simply to diminish society, to reduce it to a single norm in the name of some ill-thought-out goal. Our challenge in this task of reconciliation is not to reduce our differences, not to diminish our society, but to ensure that all our differences, which cross us many times over and make us unique, that they enrich the order and the society in which we live, but they do not detract from it. A society which would simply demand sameness or uniformity would, in my opinion, cease to be a society. It could become simply totalitarian, but more about that later. Third and finally, I want to answer the exam question set this evening of what is St. Patrick's example to us today in the 21st century with regards to a shared society and reconciliation. 21 years ago, following decades of violence and terror, which many of us lived through, and some of us at that time had not known a different world, that 1998 agreement brought about peace, perhaps an imperfect peace. That conflict and the relations on these islands for many centuries have now lived with conflicting and sometimes conflating identities where religion has been overlaid onto political, ethno and national identities. That world differed greatly from the time of St. Patrick, but there are lessons for us as we look to someone who brought to these shores the greatest gift of all, the gift of faith. And that gift has left these shores to go to all corners of the world, bringing a faith and a belief that has transformed human lives. How is that gift of faith an asset to reconciliation rather than a barrier? How do we ensure that the gift of faith is once again presented in our society and held by our society as a positive identifier rather than a problem to be solved or an impediment to the development of a shared society? Wouldn't it be an irony, ladies and gentlemen, if for the sake of a promise of progress or reconciliation, that the gift brought to us by St. Patrick would be simply cast aside or marginalised to a private sphere? As we sit here this evening, each as individuals, each as a member of various groups, perhaps with a faith, perhaps not, perhaps as Irish or British or even Northern Irish, but each with a context in which that identity plays out, we have the question of Brexit looming, and whether we are European or not, or whether we should be in the European Union or not. There is, ladies and gentlemen, a risk again in our society that that issue, the issue of Brexit, could become interwoven and conflated as religion did in our past, that it could become conflated with historic differences and contrasting and sometimes conflicting identities. We can have different positions on Brexit, as we can on all political choices, but we should be cautious about drifting into positions simply because of other identities which speak to different parts of our being. Ladies and gentlemen, they say in any speech that people really just remember one thing. So here is my attempt to leave you with just one thing. Our title, Shared Society, Reconciliation and St. Patrick. It is said that a picture tells 1,000 words. By the end of tonight, you may well be thinking, why the hell didn't he just tell us or show us 4 pictures? So here is the first and only picture. St. Patrick's Cathedral. And if I said that to you, some of you will be thinking perhaps of Armagh. Some of you perhaps will be thinking of New York. I think of somewhere else. I think of a city in excess of 20 million. I think a city where less than 2% of the population is Christian. I think of one of the world's largest Muslim cities. And I think of the spires of that cathedral dedicated to St. Patrick, co-located with a school also called St. Patrick's. And when we think of this image of St. Patrick and reconciliation and a shared society, I want you to think beyond the immediate, beyond the Irish diaspora. I want you to think of Pakistan and the Indian subcontinent. For in that school, dedicated to St. Patrick, founded in the middle of the 19th century, there is a photograph on the wall which each time I visited the cathedral I saw. And in this Catholic school, with foundations that go back to the grave that is just a few yards behind us, the photograph shows 2 former students. One, Pervez Musharraf, the former President, Prime Minister of Pakistan, and the other, a Deputy Prime Minister of India, Lal Krishani Advani. Now, ladies and gentlemen, those 2 countries in the last 60 years have fought 4 wars. They are 2 nuclear powers, and it is one of the most volatile regions of the world. But there you ask for an image of reconciliation and a legacy of a shared society. And in that school, dedicated to St. Patrick, based on faith that left these shores, a platform was created of a shared society in which 2 arch enemies could be educated together and could perhaps have an understanding that someday might have been able to perhaps have a grammar of peace. So, ladies and gentlemen, when you think of St. Patrick and you think of the faith that he brought to this island, I want you to stretch that thought. I want you to think of the Indian subcontinent. I want you to think of a city like Karachi. I want you to think of that cathedral. I want you to think of that school. And then I want you to think of the tomb that sits behind us. For that example is not unique. That example, a few miles up the road from that school in the convent of Jesus and Mary, there is yet again the example of the faith that left these shores, and a faith that had impact not only within the Christian world, but beyond. For in the convent of Jesus and Mary, 2 elderly Irish nuns remain, and their gift to the world, their work inspired by a Christian faith, was to educate the world's first female Muslim Prime Minister, Benazir Bhutto. That, ladies and gentlemen, is probably the best example I can leave you tonight of reconciliation and a shared society and the impact of St. Patrick. It's not Armagh, it's not New York, it's not the Irish diaspora, but it's a bridge of reconciliation between Hindu and Muslim in a context very far from us, but it is St. Patrick. The late Margaret Thatcher, ladies and gentlemen, is often quoted as having said, "There is no such thing as society." Now, at the risk of ridicule, you're going to have to hear me out on this one. I'm not an apologist for Lady Thatcher, but I think the quote was taken out of context, but we'll deal with that later. When we speak of society, what do we mean? Do we believe there is a society? Perhaps you should suspend judgment for a moment. But to speak of society, we also have to speak in the same breath about identity. Society is simply that which encapsulates the whole, but crucially, it is not the state, and that is vitally important in a context like Northern Ireland. Society is the all. So to ask what is society demands that we first know who we are before we answer what we are. Today at this time in the West and globally, more traditional forms of identity, ethnic and religious, seem to be pushing back on what had emerged over recent centuries and was called civic identity. People now speak of societies rather than society, and identity politics, certainly in the West, is to the fore. But why? There is no single reason that can be given which will apply across the globe. For some in a European context, the growth of such identities might be linked to growing economic inequality or marginalization. In the United States, it is likely to be similar. But regardless of where it is, the causality will be different from the symptoms. If, for example, we look to the majority Muslim world, then the rise of Islam as an identifier is less about religion per se and more down to other causes, even if the symptom is an increase in religious identity. In large part, the increase in more ethnic and religious identity comes down to the weakness of other forms of identity, and in many cases, an instrumentalization of religion or faith for purely temporal ends. In some cultures, it comes down to the absence of wider society or its conflation with the state, so there is no space for complexity of identities, just binary choices. Over recent centuries in the West and at different eras in the Middle East and other civilizations, we have managed for the most part to construct societies which were not binary, not either or. At present, we could say about our society that we are all part of a complex set of identities, cutting across social, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, economic, and the list could go on. Or could we? Would that apply here in Northern Ireland? Do we have such a society that cuts across? For me, ladies and gentlemen, society is bigger than the state. They fulfill distinct roles, and the state is just one component of the society. A healthy society will be a plurality which can allow multiple identities to exist and flourish. That would mean a place where religion is not simply tolerated, but can also help to navigate the increasingly secular world. I do not believe that building a successful society demands the eradication of difference or reducing it to meaningless labels or simply marginalizing that which we find different. Rather, it requires acceptance that differences contribute to a rich society, and those differences are not binary, but transcend us as humans multiple times over because they speak to different parts of our complex humanity. Let me make it personal. We often want to know something about a person, and then we run forward with that limited piece of knowledge to assume that we might know everything about them. Binaries work like that, but they rarely capture us. I can be Catholic, but what does that say about my views on the economy, sport, immigration, Brexit? I could be a UK citizen, and what would that say about my views on a theological question or my attitude to life? I could be Irish, and what would that say about how I choose to live my life? It is not just in these lands that there is a growing pressure which wants to reduce us to binary tribes. We see these tendencies even in very advanced democracies. Are you with Trump or against him? Are you a Brexiteer or a Remainer? These labels are thrown around as if they somehow split us into simple tribes and the rest is easy. It's history. Such parallel lives and societies can create high levels of intra-cohesion within a group, but it can also create a repressive conformity at the expense of a wider pluralist society. Who we are cannot be reduced to one simple identifier with everything else flowing from that. Why? Because humanity is more complex and richer than that. And I did promise you about Brexit. So where would that leave us with Brexit? And no, St. Patrick did not have anything to say about it. What does such a debate mean for our identities? Once again, we are being asked what we mean by Irish, British, European, Northern Irish. It could be argued that within these islands over the last 2 centuries, our identity was perhaps too broadly shaped or dominated by a political identity or a national identity, which was often conflated with a religious identity. Also, it could be argued that we tend to speak of identity in the singular rather than the plural. That focus on the singular often led us towards binary solutions. All fine, ladies and gentlemen, if a singular identity is widely shared in a very homogeneous society, but fatal if homogeneity is not shared. Binary doesn't work in those complex settings. Complex settings beget complex solutions, and surely that is the lesson of the peace process and of the agreement signed this night 21 years ago. So how are those identities playing out against a backdrop of Brexit, and how might that look in the coming century in these islands? I am conscious that the context we are living in contains much uncertainty about the UK's place in Europe and the world, about relations within the nations of the United Kingdom itself, and also the broader relationship on this island, which has been a perennial issue in recent centuries. Today, the division of identity in Britain does not appear to be on religious or national grounds, but it is a division that runs through society and even through political parties about the very cohesion within society and about the attitude and place of the United Kingdom in the world. Even if the Brexit debate is not conflated with religion or nationality today, we should be alive, conscious of the lessons of history, which can often repeat themselves, to the chance that at some point it could become conflated with religion or ethno-nationalism. Each of us, ladies and gentlemen, will have a different take on our identities or identities, because each of us was born with a unique identity, and over time, other parts of our identity have been adapted and formed. Those identities form who we are. They provide a frame of reference which can then predict actions or a framework of actions. For me, grappling with that question of identity, I define myself as part of a community with a shared set of Christian beliefs. There are obvious elements of our identities which we don't have to call out in most cases. For example, I'm male and white. But there are other parts of our identity which are not obvious, and yet which can have an even greater calling on how we respond and behave in society. For example, citizenship, nationality, political and religious or cultural perspectives. So when it comes to identities, it is never binary. It can't simply be reduced to one. We are all part of a complex set of identities cutting across social, national, ethnic, cultural, economic, and the list could go on. When we try to force the various identities into a binary form, it diminishes who we are. It diminishes the societies we belong to, and if taken to an extreme, can actually threaten the very society that we want to support. But the question is, what do our identities tell us about ourselves, and what function does it fulfill for us? Identities, ladies and gentlemen, really don't tell us much about ourselves. Rather, they tell others about us. It's how we present ourselves to others. They help others in society navigate our complexities. They give frames of reference into which we loosely fit. Some of the identities we can choose and others we are born with. Some we can give greater importance to and others we can relegate. But all the time, our identities are ways to help us integrate into a society and to say something very powerful about ourselves and how we want to be seen and perceived. So contrary to the impression that is often given that our identities are somehow only personal declarations of difference, and they are that too, which set us apart, they are fundamentally an aid to help us deal with complexity and to say something more general about who we are and what we stand for. Our task, ladies and gentlemen, in building a shared society is to help us rediscover a capacity to deal with ever more complex worlds of difference and identities, which we had managed to do so successfully in many parts of the Western world for many hundreds of years. But some will tell us that today, in order to deal with complexity or difference, we have to banish the very difference that makes us from the society. That is a false choice, because it does not allow for historical context and simply seeks to impose a uniformity, often done so violently, onto our complex worlds. One can think of the efforts of National Socialism in Germany or the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, or what was done in the name of religion across Europe after the Reformations, with religious minorities persecuted in the name of some sort of uniformity. When viewed with a wider European lens, no Christian denomination had a monopoly on suffering. In different contexts, some were the persecuted, others the persecutor, and vice versa. As we build a shared society, or try to, we have to be cognizant of our identities, to integrate them without reducing them. St. Patrick's living legacy on this island is faith. So how can we approach faith in this context when we speak of reconciliation and a shared society? History and philosophy both show us that when it comes to the place of religion in society, there is no uniformity of view across the Western world. 1789 and the French Revolution and the emergence of an all-powerful and dominant state which consumes society is not the story of these islands. Up until recently, nor was it the story of Ireland. But Ireland is a republic, and a lot will depend on how that republican tradition evolves in the second century of its existence. How it relates to religion in the second century of its existence will be very different to the first century. But the risk is that an unhealthy closeness of the first era could be followed by an unequally healthy reaction and marginalisation in the second century. What underpins pluralism is actually different Enlightenment traditions. The French state, for example, bans the headscarf on Muslim women. The United States does not. A good understanding of the Enlightenment could help us to provide a framework where contemporary citizens do not have to be either or, but could be many in both. Showing that the Enlightenment tradition of 1789 in the European tradition is not the same as that of the Pennsylvania mode of 1776 can create a thriving society without faith or ethno-nationalism becoming the basis for state identity. Societies do struggle with the question of what role religion plays or does not play in our respective societies, and how it assists or undermines cohesion. That is likely to remain so for many decades to come. It was an issue at the time of St. Patrick, with the new faith being seen by some as threatening an old power and status. The risk for us today in trying to build a shared society is that we can think that society must be neutral, to have no one's traditions or beliefs at its core. Some often drift into such a mode in an uncritical manner. In our contemporary culture, there is a very prominent voice which would suggest that the only way to deal with the differences thrown up by life and complexity is through offering a neutral space. In terms of religion, it would suggest creating a more privatized form of religion, something which would push it out of the public sphere and into the private. That ideology would have society believe that competing absolutist claims by religions should be rejected, but perhaps with one sole exception. That is the absolutist claim that a form of belief exists which should be the sole basis of society, a claim that it is neutral and objective and should therefore be the norm. That sounds a lot, ladies and gentlemen, like older forms of religion which wanted such uniformity. They tried and they failed. But the risk today is that a religion of a militant secularism is trying to offer the very same rework. Such an offer of a level playing field, one that claims to be neutral and fair and objective, could seduce policymakers and politicians as they try to navigate the complexity of our culture and try to build a shared society. Decision makers, in my experience, will naturally struggle to navigate the diversity that is now a feature of modern societies. How do you build cohesive societies amidst such a growing diversity? Gone are the days of homogeneity, when cohesion in society could rely on a common grammar. But if you aim to set out to have a shared society by creating a neutral society where differences are reduced to be meaningless or simply banished, then how is it shared, and how does it remain a society which is enriched by difference? Who decides which differences are to be valued and which to be discarded? For regulatory authorities faced with such a challenge, it might seem easier to roll back diversity from society and to try to impose a one-size-fits-all approach, arguing that it is neutral, fair, value for money, etc. You will have heard it all before. But if that is done, then what other differences could be rolled back? The new norm, what would it be neutral from, and fair to whom? In such a new era, whose values would prevail? Who would make those choices? And how would that be authentic to our different cultures and traditions? These, ladies and gentlemen, are live questions for this society and require an intellectual contribution from within the various Christian traditions. The tradition brought to us by St. Patrick, a shared tradition, is one that must be engaged. It must be engaged critically in the public debate, and we must be confident that it brings centuries of experience to the contemporary challenge. But it is not just the state that could retreat from navigating a more complex world. We as groups made up of multiple differences could retreat from navigating the complexity or promoting the distinctiveness of our cultures so that we would just somehow blend in or disappear. Society could therefore just become drab. A sort of greyness would descend, which characterised the Warsaw Pact up until the 1990s. Both temptations, blending in or rolling back difference, would be wrong, as they would greatly diminish a culturally rich and diverse society. If, ladies and gentlemen, St. Patrick had simply blended in, would we be here today? Would this centre exist? Would cathedrals such as St. Patrick's in Karachi stand out as a witness to plurality in one of the world's largest Muslim cities? The policy choices we make today will tell us something about the society we want to build and the role of the state within that society and its attitude to difference and the right to be different. History has shown us numerous examples of how impossible it is to divorce a culture from its past. And for me, how faith communities are treated can often be a litmus test for broader freedoms within the society and the place of the individual vis-à-vis the state. One can think of revolutionary France or the creation of the Soviet Union. Critiques by faith communities can help to reinforce democratic processes in liberal states by ensuring alternative perspectives are heard and groupthink is avoided. So a faith perspective not just helps the state through the provision of services, but helps to ensure the very plurality that keeps the state liberal, that is, open to consistent challenge. Without challenge, ladies and gentlemen, democratic states run the risk of becoming illiberal and fostering a culture of uniformity which can be unhealthy for the very future of democracy. Western democracies, including that in the United Kingdom and Ireland, need debate and need constant, vibrant differences to remain alive and to achieve renewal. It is their oxygen. So the debate on a shared society needs engagement, and it needs engagement from a plurality, including faith communities. A pluralist approach on the part of the state allows for a variety of voices and providers rather than a simple singularity. That's really what Mrs. Thatcher was trying to say in her now infamous quote. A plural space will be characterised by being open to greater participation by groups and other organisations, and it will avoid authoritarian tendencies on the part of the state. A truly pluralist society will often be characterised by a weaker state, a state acting as a regulator, but open to a variety of providers and voices, meeting acceptable standards and contributing to the flourishing of that wider whole. This belief in pluralism on the part of the state is not alien to the Christian tradition of St. Patrick. It is central to it. But it was not always practiced, especially in our post-Reformation centuries across Europe, as we sought to impose uniformity on each other, or for those who dared to try to be different. Today, we again have to be careful of that human tendency to coerce those who want to stand apart. And with religion growing weaker in Western countries, there could be a tendency in some quarters to simply marginalise it further. In the long run, in my view, that would weaken our societies and weaken our democracies. So in this meaning, pluralism is not just tolerance, but exchange and interest in the other and in their difference. It is not relativism, but respecting the very distinctiveness that we cherish. But at the other extreme, pluralism is not anarchy. A pluralist society is aiming to do just what it says, build or administer a society which will be plural and thus shared. Its goal is a society by plural means, and that will mean regulation and minimum standard. The history of humanity could be said to be about navigating or setting those minimum standards and always ensuring a balanced equilibrium between individuals, communities and the state or its historical precedents. That is what we achieved some 21 years ago in this society. It is highly unlikely that the boundaries between state and communities and individuals will ever be definitively settled. They are always likely to be blurred, and that is often the challenge of living in a community, balancing interests, rights and obligations. Pluralism helps the very cohesion in a society that allows them to function. But as we build that shared society, we might think that our differences can be cast aside to be replaced with neutral, dry regulations. Some might think that we can roll back that which is distinctive and come to rely on neutral regulations as a means of providing much needed cohesion and solidarity. But is that enough to keep a society together? Will we be bound together by dry regulation? We can see from the world of economics and the financial crisis of 2008 that simple, dry regulation is not enough. Professor Philip Booth said recently, regardless of how we regulate economic activity, there is no substitute for resourceful, ethical people in all sectors of the economy. In place of virtue, we have seen an expansion of regulation. A society that is held together just by compliance to rules is inherently fragile, open to further abuses, which will be met by a further expansion of regulation. This can never be enough. Regulation won't help us with integration or the socialization of society. It's not enough to build shared societies or to keep them together. The then Joseph Ratzinger provided a framework beyond regulation, and one which partly came from his dialogue in the early years of the millennium with the philosopher Jürgen Habermas. He wrote, "Only in conditions of healthy secularity can a society be constructed in which diverse traditions, cultures and religions peacefully coexist." He said, "To totally separate public life from all valuing of traditions means to embark on a closed dead-end path." Ladies and gentlemen, his healthy secularism is a definition of pluralism, a definition of our shared society, and a clear rejection of an approach based on reductionist regulations and a neutral space of nothingness. So what does all this mean in our cultural and political context today? What role should the faith given to us by St. Patrick play in our society, and how should it contribute through individual or collective action or both? This evening I would suggest that our approach to faith in society, to the role of faith bodies in providing services, most notably education and health, is a product of a unique historical context and a philosophical tradition born out of that context, which started here with St. Patrick and has taken us on centuries of discovery, of trial, and a lot of mistakes. Our approach to faith bodies acting in society tells us something about our state and society. But we run the risk, even here, that if we do not know our own tradition sufficiently well and the particular context that give birth to that tradition, then we might be tempted to import a model of behaviour which we think is similar or feasible, but is not a product of our particular cultural or historical context. That, in my view, could lead to a rupture in the relationship between state and society, of which the faith dimension is one of the central elements. In the face of complexity or challenge, and we have enough of that in our contemporary society, we cannot abandon all too easily that which has served us well in recent centuries, and which we have arrived at, often after very painful and turbulent efforts for inclusion, whether as people of faith or of no spiritual belief. So what role do we want to play in our changing society? Ladies and gentlemen, it all depends on how the state sees itself concerning broader society. If our state adopts a pluralist approach as set out above, then a shared society can thrive and it can take hold. However, if the state takes a more absolutist model to the detriment of society, then it is unlikely that a shared society will grow or flourish. And while that would be a regret due to the loss of state-funded initiatives which support society, it would be an even greater loss to society because of what it would signify, because society would lose some of its most core and basic freedoms at the expense of an ever-encroaching state, which now has the technological capability to reach into all aspects of our lives. Ultimately, your freedom and my freedom would be impinged, societal and personal. As state pays, so state rules approach could lead to a totalitarian state and upset the inherent equilibrium in a society which all democratic states should strive for. The state, ladies and gentlemen, to avoid that, should encourage what de Tocqueville called the mediating associations between people and the state that carve out room for a good and virtuous life. The risk, as highlighted by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, is that the modern secular state sees itself in competition with such communities and associations, and as the state's resources grow, it will seek to wipe out the alternatives. Ultimately, unless very careful, secular states with absolutist tendencies can weaken, even destroy democracy, which requires difference to function and renew itself through constant questioning and reflection. So how do we avoid such a situation arising where the state in the Western democratic tradition becomes illiberal? What role for difference? How do we not only ensure the survival of inherent freedoms that exist in society? We do so, ladies and gentlemen, by engaging and responding coherently to arguments which question our role in society, just as St. Patrick engaged in centuries before us to challenge a prevailing order and to be a creative minority on the contemporary culture. And we do not just do so to protect vested interests, if they exist, but we do so for a broader service to society, to ensure it remains open, to be inclusive, and to be rooted in its core values, and always alive to critique. St. Patrick brought the Christian faith to these shores, and as such, he opened up to us a world and a civilization beyond our immediate consciousness. Today, the role of faith and the challenge is the same. It is to remind us of the common humanity of all, to transcend immediate differences, not by forgetting them, to challenge our prejudices, to overcome binaries, and to remind us of the transcendent and spiritual calling that each of us has through this gift of human life. The role of faith in society today is to help to ensure a vibrant, pluralist, shared space in which not just faith-based institutions can thrive, but where all organisations and individuals can contribute. To succeed in this, we must set the argument in its widest context and show that it is not just about protecting vested interest, important as that is to society, but it goes much broader and deeper, and it touches the very notion of freedom within our society, present and future. Within that context, ladies and gentlemen, faith groups should always be free to make a distinctive offering to the society, complementing others and without discrimination. Of course, to do that will prove challenging along the way. Complexity always is, but it was even more so for St. Patrick. But engagement and participation is always preferable in a society to isolation and marginalisation, both for state groups and individuals, provided one does not lose its independence or distinctiveness to the other. When faced with a choice, even when it is hard, we should always believe that the opportunities to serve the greater good in society are much stronger than the challenges, and that even the challenges, ladies and gentlemen, even when they are tough, they will help us to remain agile, to refresh our offer, and provide the opportunity to reacquaint ourselves with our own rich intellectual tradition of why things are as they are. In these lands, those traditions are centuries old, and with our faith, they start here with St. Patrick, who brought the message of Christ to these shores. We must never be complacent about our pluralism, and we must protect and promote it with intellectual rigour because of the wider freedoms it supports in society. And one of those central freedoms is the gift of faith from St. Patrick. That offer, illustrated by the spires of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Karachi, helps us to keep our societies pluralist and shared through providing an alternative paradigm, and one which is capable of giving deeper meaning in an ever faster and changing society. Such an offer, ladies and gentlemen, is in all our interests, whether religious or not. And for that living legacy, we owe you a debt of gratitude, St. Patrick. Thank you.
Professor Campbell, thank you so much for that very informative and erudite lecture. There is an opportunity, I hope, for us maybe to be able to ask some questions, if there are those in the audience who may want to do that, both about your lecture and perhaps about the many occupations that you've had during your professional life. Does anybody want to start?
Can I just ask you a question about your description of the pluralist society? Can you speak a little bit on what that would mean for the church, particularly in terms of an evangelical or a missiological approach from the church and with different faiths? So if they're all coming together in this shared space, what is it that they have to give away in order to achieve that pluralist society?
So I think the challenge usually when we get, so I stick first within Christianity, but then broaden it out a little bit. The issue is whether you allow religious freedom to others. So do you allow people to convert? Is there a religious freedom to convert? If there's an acceptance of that, and if you accept the legitimate laws of the land, so you are allowing a degree of freedom, then for me that's a pluralist space. But there are tensions there both within religions but also within the state, and I think perhaps actually the state's actions, my concern with some state actions would be that an approach is drifting in which goes along the lines of wouldn't all right-thinking people think like us? And that some views of religious communities are cast against a contemporary religion, which is at times militantly secular, which leaves no space for conscience, no space for an individual to express their faith. Now, if we were to broaden it out in relation to other societies, Islam comes into the focus quite a bit. And we are presented sometimes with views of a majority Muslim society that tends to be the extreme. The reason I cite the spires of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Karachi is it's probably an image that jars with a lot of people because it's not an image that people would associate with Pakistan. And as we have in the West a spectrum of religious practice, so too in the majority Muslim world there is a spectrum of religious practice. So not everything is like Saudi Arabia. So you could go from a theocracy like Saudi Arabia or Iran right through to a completely militantly secular regime like what had existed in Albania during the Cold War. Somewhere in between there is accommodation. And getting that accommodation right is never going to be eternally settled. It's going to require, push and pull. And politicians, I think, always navigate that when they're in office. If a politician becomes a cleric or a bishop, that would be wrong. Likewise, if a cleric becomes a politician, that would be wrong. I expect them to be distinct, but I expect them to be engaging there as a creative minority to try to find an accommodation. I think when the state begins to try to encroach into what would be the legitimate religious freedom of religions to operate within the law, if the law is defined in a just way, then I think that's where state boundary is becoming problematic, and I would say it's becoming quasi-religious. But equally, where you might have a religious group, and that's where I address the issue that pluralism is not anarchy. The state and the society has to have basic norms by which everyone in society agrees. So it is a creative, healthy tension that will exist for as long as humanity exists, and it always has. But it's where one tries to completely eradicate the other, or to conflate the state with religion, or to conflate the state with society. The examples I would cite there, National Socialism, but in particular what we saw from 1917 on, and the complete attempt to eradicate any religious view as part of the atheistic communism from the Soviet Union. And that's fundamentally about not wanting an alternative critique in society. True democracy will always want an alternative critique. It just helps to keep it grounded and real. That for me would be the boundary.
Thank you. I just love sitting at your feet, Francis. This is the third time I think I've sat at your feet and always got a lot from it. I'm wondering if you, before you fly off to Australia, could tell us where you observe secularism in England becoming absolutist. Because generally what happens in England can happen very quickly in Ireland, though sometimes in these days things happen more quickly in Ireland. In what areas do you see a danger of secularism becoming absolutist and saying, no, you must fit with this. This is the agreed norm now of our society, and you do not have the right to exempt yourself from that.
So it's a very good question. I think it already exists and it has yet to be implemented. I think for me, the decision in the early years of the millennium around the adoption agencies introduced into public policy the notion of the state pays, so the state says approach. And up to that time, I would characterise the UK system in the absence of a written constitution as really always striving for pragmatism. So making sure that somewhere in the provision under the civil law or under the common law, there was an accommodation. And it's the reason we have 26% of children in the United Kingdom go to denominational schools, mostly Anglican and Catholic. But the adoption agency's ruling was a very interesting one because it saw the closure of the Catholic adoption agencies. And the offer of the Catholic adoption agencies was, it said, look, it's 6% of the provision, and there's a pragmatism here because 94% of the provision, is open, is but we're asking for this sort of cultural or religious exemption over here. And the government of the day said no to that, and the Catholic adoption agencies had to close. Now, I'm wondering if that applied to education. Okay? So if the state curriculum conflicts with the Christian catechism, what happens there? Where does that lead? Does that mean that you would then go through a series of steps that denominational schooling of any sort would not be permissible? Would it mean that you couldn't teach religion or a catechism in a denominational school? Would that have to be done privately? Now, that could be done, and it works very effectively in different parts of the world. But the risk, the real risk I see here, and perhaps the diplomat in me didn't allow me to spell it out too much. I think in policy circles in Britain, people see the French model of secularism as attractive. Just get religion out of the state. Seems simple. Marginalise it. But that's not our tradition. We didn't have a revolution. we have evolution, we have a completely different historical trajectory. And if you talk to senior French officials, they say, you completely misunderstand our separation of church and state in France. It's not, it may be legally there, but it's actually a very carefully constructed accommodation. It's like the power of the monarch. So if you look at the monarch in relation to our traditions, you think the monarch is all powerful. But actually it's not. The monarch in the English system is actually quite limited powers. Ditto for the separation of religion and the state in France. That's born out of a very unique historical context where the French find an accommodation. So if you're looking at social and scientific issues in France, you will often find that the panel will also have people of faith and ethicists on the panel, will not solely be scientists. Whereas in Britain, with an established church in England, it would be very unusual to have ethicists and the people of faith in the panel who tend to be solely scientists if you're looking at some of the scientific advances. So my fear is that in the UK system, especially with the diversity of faiths that is coming, it's there and it's getting even stronger, that people are struggling with how do we deal with schools that are coming from within communities where there isn't a hierarchical religious order. Let's reach into the French model. Let's take that. That then raises a whole series of other problems. And you know, there's many things we can be critical about our system between the UK and Ireland. And sometimes we're overcritical. But I think that our system has done a far better job of integration than some of the continental models that some of our politicians and policymakers seem to be attracted to. So I would be saying, hold steady, stick to our model that we have tried and tested. Do not return to some sort of narrow uniformity that tries to get people to adhere to a very particular Republican identity. Let me finish with this. I think if I had been born in French society rather than in the UK, I don't think I could have joined the Foreign Office, their equivalent, because you would have to have been French Republican first. Everything else was secondary. This system here, up until now, and I hope it remains, allows for an agility of identities. And that's enshrined in the Belfast Agreement. But it's also enshrined, I think, in the way that the society has evolved. You can be X and Y and Z. You don't have to take a national identity and put your religious identity or other parts of your identity which speak to different parts of your being. But I fear that we're entering a phase of clumsy thinking where people will be looking for simplistic solutions. And that's not part of our philosophical tradition. It's a completely different enlightenment and a completely different history.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Francis. We go back a long, long time. But tonight, you're talking about St. Patrick and the issue of reconciliation and pluralism. And as we look at our divided society at the moment, not only here, but I look at it in Britain as a consequence of Brexit and all that has unleashed on society. You look at it in terms of Trump and those binary choices that people, and you look at South America with Venezuela and Maduro and various other countries. What would have been the lessons of Patrick to heal those differences and to show that we are different, but at the same time we can work together in partnership?
I think the primary lesson of Patrick, the thing that was, always put yourself in the footsteps of a historical figure. Patrick fundamentally forgave, but forgiveness was based on understanding. In order for him to understand, he had to listen. Now, Margaret, you're a politician from a noble era in our political landscape. When I look in today at the House of Commons, and the loudest voices seem to have the most airtime, I just ask you, and I ask others, are they listening? People are shouting. They're shouting in our society. And the risk that we face, I think, is that we descend. We're descending into an era, you took out your phone, you've got Twitter, you've got Facebook, and something complex that we don't know the answer to. You have somebody standing on your television screen asserting the answer. And I sit with amazement looking in sometimes at some of our representatives speaking from Parliament, especially in Central Lobby. And they're speaking about World Trade Organization rules, and they're speaking about trade agreements with Europe, and they're speaking about aspects of the treaty. And I sat at the table for some years in Brussels representing the United Kingdom on the enlargement of the European Union and each of those trade agreements. And I would not have the expertise to stand and say, I know the answer to this. But sadly, our appetite seems to have become for the loud and the vulgar. And people asserting, and we tend to think, oh, maybe they know. And I think the example of St. Patrick for our contemporary period, and I hope people like yourself in political life, that coming after you in future generations will be people who will have what St. Patrick had, which was to understand. He couldn't have evangelized if he didn't understand, if he didn't listen. But I fear that we are in an era where listening is a lost art. People simply shout. And what has happened in this society and what is happening in other societies is binaries are re-emerging. You can feel very good when your group's over there and your group is over there. And I hope we don't go back to that. But my fear in other parts of the world is that they're going towards that. And I think the only word of caution I would say is try to find the political leaders who sometimes say, I don't know the answer to that. That for me is maturity.
Francis, your talk, thank you very much for that. Could you give an interpretation of how you see the recent visits of Pope Francis to majority Muslim countries, more recently Morocco and then UAE a few months ago? What was he trying to achieve in that?
I think there's an image that's come out in the last 24 hours which is very arresting. And it's an image, he's in Rome in the Apostolic Palace with the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he goes in to meet the South Sudanese war leaders who have been fighting in what is one of the world's newest states. And he's brought them to Rome to do a retreat, a Lenten retreat. And he goes into the room and he gets down, now bear in mind his age, but he gets down on his knees and he kisses the feet of each of these war leaders. That's an arresting image, not for what he's doing, but I'm looking at their reaction and they don't know how to handle it. Now, I think how we view people like the Pope in a context of a Christian world is one thing. But an image like that, translated into the Muslim world, that image really does speak 1,000 words. and it continues to speak them. Let me tell you one story which may illustrate this, which happened to me in Karachi. We had, every time there was a burning of the Quran or something in the West, we would get the brunt of that, or in Karachi, or in Pakistan, or the Christian communities would get the brunt of it. And the Christian communities didn't have protection. We had limited protection, but we had 3 blast walls and we had hundreds of security, but still, even with that, we were a focal point of the West. And one pastor burnt the Quran in Florida, and it led to widespread violence across the Muslim world on Friday after the day of prayer. People were killed right across the world, and in Karachi, we had evacuated, but 4 of us had to stay behind, and myself and 3 security. And it was probably, I think to this day, it was probably the scariest day of my personal and professional life, because in a sense you were nearly preparing for the end, because at that stage if a mob overruns the embassy, you can't keep it back. You don't survive. But when everything died down, and the Pakistani police did a wonderful job protecting us, really wonderful job. Later that week, one very quite well-travelled, educated local gentleman said to me, he said, "The thing I can't understand about this incident," he said, "is why the Pope allows him to do it." And I thought, God. And that observation challenged me to the core, and has challenged me more than anything else in a diplomatic sense, because it made me question my own prejudice. To that Pakistani Muslim, the way we bring binaries together, that pastor, who has nothing to do with mainstream Christianity and is a law unto themselves, to that pastor, to that Muslim, he's under the Pope. He's a Christian. He represents Christianity. Now, here I'm going to throw it back to you. When you see the Muslim equivalent of that pastor shouting or calling for the murder of Aisha Bibi, the Christian lady on death row, but it was on death row in Pakistan, or burning the Bible, do we see that individual as a representative of 1 billion Muslims? And if we're honest, that question to me about why the Pope didn't sanction this pastor, that challenged me to question my own views and assumptions that I absorbed from the media about what I perceived subliminally with regards to Islam and who represented it. So when the Pope goes to majority Muslim countries and does what he does, or when he goes to Morocco, or when he makes the Cardinal of Karachi a cardinal, when he elevates them, he is demystifying. He's acting as an ambassador for Christ. He's acting as an ambassador for a civilization, which is the West. And whether we are religious or not, others perceive the West to be Christian. So by him doing these acts, he's doing one of the most fundamental acts of diplomacy, which is the symbol, which is the friendship, and bring it right home. Who else did such an act that even through the Brexit period and the risk of the binaries and the divisions and people pulling apart, who else in our context carried out such a pilgrimage, although she wouldn't call it that? Elizabeth II, done. politician, no minister could have done what she did in Dublin Castle or at the Garden of Remembrance or in Croke Park. That's the action of a person of faith. So I think it's a brilliant question, Paul John. And the only thing I would say is we're capturing probably a small part of the symbolism that's involved in the act. But the Pakistanis or the Muslims are just capturing so much so that the next time some pastor burns the Quran, people will have a more powerful image of a Christian leader acting as an ambassador. And I think that helps to really bring our societies much closer together.
Wonderful. Well, that's been an excellent evening. Thank you so much. It just leaves me to, number one, congratulate you because I believe recently you have got another job, and that is as the Vice-Chancellor of Notre Dame colleges, universities in Australia. So congratulations on that. You're going to be on a 17.5-hour flight very regularly, I'm told. So we congratulate you. And also we have got a little something for you from the St. Patrick's Centre. There is an opportunity, everyone, if anybody wants to come tea or coffee, we have got tea and coffee outside, so there will be an opportunity, hopefully, for you to talk personally with Francis. So thank you very much. Hey Brian, how are you doing? Keeping well?
Can I organise it before the
Yes, would you mind?
I will hide down on